They say blood remembers what the mind tries to forget. In a small valley where the mist clings to the ground like an old memory, there once stood the Merrin homestead, a place so silent that even the crows refused to perch on its roof. The locals whispered that the house was built on sacred land, that its stones were older than any church in the county. But that wasn't what made people stay away. It was the family inside. The Merrins weren't like other folks. Every son born to them carried the same eyes, pale gray, cold as steel, reflecting no light, and every daughter was his mirror. Twins, always twins, every generation. The town physician once said it was a marvel of genetics. The priest called it a curse, but no one knew the truth. Not until one of them broke the silence. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. You see, the Merrins had a tradition, an ancient one, passed in whispers, never written down. When the twins came of age, they didn't marry outsiders. They married each other, brother to sister, blood to blood. The justification was always the same: to preserve the family's purity, to keep the bloodline unbroken, and for nearly a century no one dared question it. Until Samuel Merrin. He was the youngest of the last generation, a boy who watched his father wed his twin sister, who saw his uncles do the same, and as he grew older he was told his fate had already been decided. His twin Eliza was his bride-to-be. The family's legacy depended on it. But Samuel had questions. He had seen the birth defects, the madness that crept through his father's eyes, the strange whispers his mother muttered at night. He had seen his aunt's stillborn child, born with two hearts that refused to beat. When Samuel turned 19, he began to write pages and pages of his family's history, names, dates, marriages, deaths. He wrote about the rituals, the vows spoken beneath the oak tree behind the house, the strange symbols carved into the bark. It was all there, a confession wrapped in ancestry. And one night, just before he vanished, he left a single line scrawled across the final page. They said God made us in his image, but the Merrins remade themselves in their own. The earliest record of the Merrin name comes from 1794, a ship manifest from the coast of Maine. Thomas and Abigail Merrin, settlers from the English countryside, listed as farmers, carrying with them little more than 2 trunks and a family Bible with half its pages missing. They purchased land deep in the valley, acres of untouched wilderness that no one else seemed to want. Locals claimed it was cursed ground, but Thomas insisted it was promised land. From the beginning, the Merrins kept to themselves. They built their home far from the village, they worshipped privately, and their children rarely mingled with others. The family grew in number, but always in a pattern no one could explain. Only twins, always male and female, generation after generation. It became a kind of miracle, though some whispered it wasn't one granted by God. One account, written in a local pastor's journal from 1832, describes visiting the Merrin farm to baptize 2 newborns, a boy and a girl, Samuel and Sarah. He wrote that the parents refused holy water, insisting their children had already been blessed in the old way. When pressed, they showed him a small wooden charm, 2 figures carved together at the chest, their faces worn smooth by touch. The pastor never returned. The Merrins buried their dead on their own land. No gravestones bore dates, only the family crest, 2 snakes intertwined around a ring. It became a symbol of their unity, but also their curse. With each generation their isolation deepened, their language, their prayers, even their songs turned inward, private, spoken only in the home. Neighbors noticed strange things, lights burning at dawn, fires in the woods, the sound of children crying in the night. But whenever anyone came close, the Merrins would smile, polite, calm, eyes unblinking. They seemed perfect, too perfect. By the late 1800s, whispers of deformities began to spread. Babies born blind, infants who didn't breathe past their first day. The Merrins claimed it was God's testing. Others said it was something else entirely, that the blood had grown tired of folding in on itself. Still, the family line endured, and in every generation, there was always one child who questioned, who resisted, who disappeared before the next harvest. And for nearly a century, the valley kept their secret buried. By the turn of the 20th century, the Merrin homestead had grown into something monstrous. What began as a 2-room cabin had become a sprawling, uneven structure, each generation adding wings and halls in directions that defied reason. Rooms connected to rooms, staircases led to sealed doors, and in the center of it all stood the oldest part, the hearth, blackened with age and layered with soot that no one dared to clean. Visitors described the house as alive. It groaned when the wind passed through, as if sighing under the weight of its own memory. The wallpaper pulsed with moisture from the valley fog, and the smell of earth and decay hung thick in every corridor. And yet, within that ruin the Merrins thrived, or at least pretended to. They were wealthy by then, though no one could explain why. They owned no businesses, sold no crops, and rarely ventured into town. Still, they paid their taxes in gold year after year. Some said they'd found something buried deep beneath the land. Oil, silver, bones. Others believed it was something far older than the soil itself. It was during this time that the family began keeping records, not for the outside world, but for themselves. Leather-bound ledgers filled with names, marriages, stillbirths, and bindings. That was the word they used instead of wedding. Every entry was signed by 2 witnesses, always twins, always bound by blood. And the most curious thing, every ledger ended the same way, the page torn out, replaced by a scrap of parchment bearing only the family crest and a Latin phrase scrawled beneath it. Sanguis in sanguine renascitur. Blood is reborn in blood, and no one outside the family ever read those books. But in 1924, a man named Reverend John Calder, a missionary newly arrived in the valley, tried to break that silence. He wrote that he'd been invited to the Merrin home under the pretense of prayer. When he entered, he saw walls covered in framed portraits. Generations of faces, nearly identical, all staring forward with the same gray eyes. He said it felt like looking into mirrors that reflected nothing human. A week later, his church burned to the ground. The Reverend was never seen again. After that, the townspeople stopped asking questions. The valley grew quiet, and the Merrin house, that twisting, breathing monument of sin, stood untouched for another 50 years. The last generation of Merrins was born in 1949, Samuel and Eliza. Their birth was marked by a storm that tore through the valley and split the oldest oak on the property in half. The locals called it an omen. The family called it destiny. From the beginning, Samuel and Eliza were inseparable. They shared a language only they seemed to understand, whispers in the dark, murmurs at the breakfast table that made their mother cry and their father smile. By the time they were 7, they'd stopped attending the local school. Private tutoring, the family said. But the truth was simpler. The children were too strange, too quiet, too alike. Those who caught a glimpse of them in town said they moved like reflections. When one turned, the other followed. When one smiled, the other's lips moved a second later. It was as if they weren't 2 souls at all, but one being, divided into halves. Their father, Jonathan Merrin, was the last to keep the family records. He believed the bloodline's purity had weakened, that too many generations had allowed doubt to fester. He was determined to restore what he called the original covenant. The twins were his chance to make the family whole again. He began preparing them early, taking them into the woods at night, teaching them the old prayers, the songs their ancestors had whispered. He told them stories about the first Merrin twins, how they'd been chosen by divine forces to bind their spirits in flesh. Samuel asked once what happened if the bond was broken. Jonathan struck him across the face and said, "The soul dies with it." Eliza, quiet and obedient, accepted their father's words as gospel. But Samuel began to see the cracks. He saw the family's decline, the miscarriages, the madness in his uncle's eyes, the things that moved in the shadows of their house when everyone else was asleep. When he turned 17, he started writing again. Journals filled with questions, sketches, fragments of memories that didn't belong to him. He felt haunted by the faces in the portraits. He said he could hear them whispering in the walls. On his 18th birthday, the binding was announced. The ceremony would take place under the split oak, where generations had spoken the same vows. Eliza said nothing. Samuel smiled for the family photograph, the last one ever taken in the Merrin home. A month later, he disappeared. The official record says Samuel Merrin vanished on April 12, 1968, but the official record tells nothing of the night itself. According to his sister, Eliza, he went walking after dinner, out past the fields toward the edge of the woods. He never came back. That was the story she repeated to the sheriff, to the pastor, and to anyone who asked. But those who saw her in the days that followed said her hands wouldn't stop trembling, and her voice broke each time she said his name. The sheriff searched the woods for a week. They found nothing, no footprints, no clothing, not even a broken branch. Only a single object beneath the old oak, a book wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were Samuel's writings, the history of the Merrin family, the rituals, the secrets. And on the final page, written in his hand, was that same line. They said God made us in his image, but the Merrins remade themselves in their own. After that, the sheriff sealed the valley records. He said the boy had likely run off to the city, a case closed by convenience. But the townspeople knew better. On certain nights, when the fog rolled low, some claimed to see a lantern moving between the trees. Always near the oak, always alone. Eliza never left the house again. She lived there until her death in 1991, never speaking of her brother, never taking another husband. But in her later years, a caretaker named Ruth testified that Eliza would wake screaming in the night, saying, "He's still in the walls, he's waiting for me to tell." Ruth also claimed that Eliza kept one room locked, the twins' old nursery. When Eliza died, Ruth broke the lock. Inside were Samuel's sketches, hundreds of them, covering every inch of the wallpaper. Each drawing was the same, the Merrin house split in half, bleeding from its center, as if the walls themselves had been wounded. No one knows who buried Eliza. When Ruth returned the next morning, the body was gone. Only her nightgown remained, laid neatly across the bed, with 2 rings placed side by side on the pillow. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run, or would you face what your family tried to bury? Because the story doesn't end with Samuel's disappearance. When the Merrin house was finally sold in 1993, no one wanted to touch it. It sat for months, windows broken, roof sagging, the air thick with mildew and silence. Then a man named Henry Dobbins bought the land at auction. He was a contractor from Portland, interested only in the timber and stone. He planned to tear the place down. But demolition stopped 2 days after it began. One of Henry's crew members, a young worker named Clay, pried up a section of floorboards in the main hall and found something beneath. A wooden box sealed with wax and wrapped in what looked like animal hide. Inside were papers, brittle, yellowed, and a single human tooth tied with red thread. Henry turned it over to the sheriff, thinking it was nothing more than family relics. But the sheriff recognized the handwriting. It was Samuel Merrin's. The documents were a confession, or perhaps a warning. Samuel had written that he'd uncovered the true origin of the Merrin curse. Not divine, not superstition, but human. It began with Thomas Merrin, the first settler, a man obsessed with creating life, unspoiled by outside blood. He'd been a follower of a defrocked preacher who claimed that perfection could be achieved through purity of reflection. Thomas took it literally. Samuel wrote that his ancestors had turned that doctrine into ritual, forcing twins to unite, generation after generation, believing that through sameness, the soul could become eternal. But the result was not purity. It was madness, flesh and spirit folding in on themselves until they broke. And worse, Samuel claimed the family knew what they were doing, that they believed their suffering was proof of their sanctity. He said he'd tried to stop the cycle, to expose the truth, but that his father had bound him before he could escape. The rest of his notes devolved into scrawls and fragments. The roots drink from us. The house listens. Eliza will hear them too. The sheriff returned the box to the county archives, though some say it never made it there. Henry Dobbins abandoned the project and left the valley, muttering that something was wrong with the ground. And within a year, the Merrin house was gone, burned to ashes one night without a single spark seen from the road. Locals said it was lightning. Others swore they saw 2 figures standing in the flames, hand in hand, smiling. After the fire, the Merrin land lay empty, or so the county records claimed. But those who lived nearby began to notice strange things. Their animals refused to graze near the fence line. Birds flew around the valley rather than over it, and sometimes on still nights you could hear what sounded like 2 voices, one low, one soft, echoing where the house once stood. No one built there again. Not the county, not private buyers, not even drifters. Every attempt ended the same way: accidents, illnesses, sudden deaths. By 1997, the locals started calling it the Hollow, a place best left to the wild. And yet, People kept finding things in the soil, a jar of preserved hair sealed with wax, rusted rings always in pairs, bones that were small, too small, buried in shallow earth. The sheriff's office dismissed them as animal remains, but one deputy quit soon after, saying he'd seen teeth, human teeth, still wrapped in silk. That same year, a group of university students came to the valley to document forgotten American folklore. They spent 3 nights camping on the Merrin property. Only 2 came back. Their report was never published, but one of them, years later, posted online about what they saw. He said the ground moved at night, as if something underneath was breathing. He said he heard a woman's voice whispering from the trees, "You shouldn't have dug here." And the strangest part, each time the fog rises in early spring, the outline of the Merrin house returns. Locals swear they can see it, just a silhouette, black against the moonlight. Windows glowing faintly even though nothing stands there. There's a saying in that part of Maine now, if you hear 2 voices, don't answer. The first voice calls you by name. The second sounds just like your own. Some believe it's the spirits of Samuel and Eliza, bound forever by the covenant their ancestors made. Others think it's something older, the echo of a family trying to drag the living back into its bloodline. But the truth is that no one who's gone into the hollow after dark has ever stayed sane enough to tell what they found. The valley doesn't sleep, it waits. In 2004, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Price came across the Merrin case while cataloging regional family records for the Maine Historical Archive. She'd been tracing patterns of generational isolation in early settler families. But the Merrins stood apart. No census data beyond 1880. No marriage certificates except those signed by the same hand. Every photograph blurred at the edges as though time itself had refused to hold their image. Eleanor was methodical. She requested the sealed sheriff's files from 1968, the year Samuel vanished. To her surprise, the box arrived half empty. The journals, the maps, and the supposed confession beneath the floorboards were all gone. Only a single sheet remained, a carbon copy of a letter unsigned, undated. It read, "You can burn the house, but not the blood. It knows where to go." She thought it was a hoax. But the deeper she looked, the stranger it became. Every attempt to contact living descendants failed. Birth certificates were falsified, marriage records redacted. It was as if the Merrin line had evaporated. And yet, during her research, Eleanor began receiving calls from an unlisted number. No one spoke. Only 2 faint voices, overlapping in rhythm, whispering her name. She stopped sleeping. Her notes became erratic. She wrote that she'd started seeing reflections that didn't match her movements, always just a fraction delayed. At first, she thought it was stress. But then one night, she found something in her apartment. A small wooden charm on her desk. 2 figures carved together at the chest, faces smooth from touch. The same charm described by the 1832 pastor who vanished. Eleanor left Maine the next morning. She was last seen checking into a motel outside Concord, New Hampshire. What happened next is unclear. The maid who cleaned her room found her research scattered across the floor, and a single tape recorder still running. The recording lasts 23 minutes. Most of it is static, but in the final seconds, 2 voices emerge. One male, one female, both whispering the same phrase in unison. The twins are never gone, they just wait for a mirror. The tape now sits in the county archive, mislabeled as Unidentified Oral History 2004. No one will listen to it anymore. Not after what happened to the last archivist who tried. The Merrin story should have ended long ago, burned with the house, buried beneath the roots of that cursed oak. But history has a way of resurfacing, especially when it's written in blood. In 2011, a small genealogical forum online began circulating photographs of 2 children found in an abandoned farmhouse near Bangor. A brother and sister twins, pale skin, gray eyes, no parents, no records. When the police arrived, the children were gone. Only 2 rings left behind on the kitchen table, placed side by side. Some said it was a prank, others an internet hoax. But a user under the name S. Merrin posted a message the next day. It read, "We were never the curse. We were the cure." The account was deleted within minutes. Since then, reports have continued. Pairs of twins appearing in counties across Maine and Vermont, showing up on camera for a moment before vanishing again. No one ever hears them speak, but people who've met them say their presence feels wrong. Like looking into a photograph that's trying to remember you. Historians, pastors, and skeptics have all tried to explain the Merrin story as a myth, a moral warning about isolation and fanaticism. But there's something that never fits the pattern. Every century, new twins are born bearing the same features, the same eyes, the same silence. The bloodline should have died out, and yet it hasn't. Maybe Samuel was right. Maybe the Merrins remade themselves in their own image. Maybe what he tried to stop couldn't be stopped at all. Because if you look close enough, the pattern isn't fading. It's spreading. Old census data shows clusters of twins rising across the Northeast. Geneticists say it's coincidence. But for those who know the Merrin story, it feels like something waking up, something remembering. So if you ever find yourself driving through that valley, and the fog rolls low over the fields, don't stop. Don't look toward the trees. And if you see two figures standing hand in hand near the old oak, keep your eyes on the road, because they're not waiting for you to see them. They're waiting for you to recognize them. And maybe, just maybe, part of you already does, because the blood doesn't end. It remembers, and it's still calling itself Merrin.